Hey guys, my name is Khadroth, and today I'm going to be talking to you about why balance matters so much in FGO. This is a topic of conversation I think that comes up all the time on my streams. It's something that I know I've talked with a lot of you guys about over time, and it's a really interesting subject matter. So it's something I kind of wanted to cover for the purposes of, again, just kind of provoking the conversation on it. But keep in mind too that there's a lot of reasons that the devs do things for that maybe aren't apparent to us as players. Also, I am going to be making at least one of the demonstrations here using the NP damage list that you guys can see on screen. I will link that in the video below if you guys want, or sorry, in the description below if you guys want access to it. But keep in mind, stuff like this, these are just tools for comparison's sake. They're not necessarily meant to be anything that you guys take super literal. Again, we can buff all sorts of units in the game and make units really good, but the majority of points that I really want to make here is that balance does matter in the game. And a lot of people kind of tell me like, hey Kat, you know, this is a single player game, does balance really matter? Who cares, right? Problem is, it kind of does, and there's a couple of reasons why. And again, I think even just looking at this maybe from a game dev standpoint, there's a couple of reasons why, but also from a player standpoint there are. And the first one about those is just going to be, in general, your rolling concerns. So on screen right now, you guys can basically see Fairy Knight Melisson, and this is one of those deals where, again, I think she's someone that I use all the time for example purposes for this. Melisson's a unit that comes out with LB6, and her damage, at least when she first came out, when she was first revealed, a lot of people thought like, hey, she's pretty good. I really like the fact that she can change between a single target and an AoE NP. And that right there is a balanced consideration in of itself, because we didn't have a single unit in the game that did that before. So you maybe have power creep coming into play, but ultimately at the end of the day, she wasn't that broken at first. And it was only when Oberon started to be a thing, once we started to know about him from the story and everything like that, we had an idea of what his kit would be. Even then, still doing some analysis, it looked like she'd be a little bit short of being able to be like totally broken, aka being able to 3-turn from 0% charge as an all AoE unit. And the reason that matters for her is because, one, that allows her to touch Black Grail, and two, that allows her to keep stacking her overcharge effect on her NP that grants her, again, just more buster up for 3 turns. So it just makes her scale really strong. It makes her go really hard. And that's kind of why the second she was able to do that, she kind of just took off. And so all of a sudden we get Koyan Sky into the mix, and that extra little oomph that she needed was there. So with Koyan Sky and Oberon, Melisson becomes really crazy good. So the original point here, though, was the rolling concerns. Why does that matter? It doesn't matter for Melisson. In fact, most of you guys are probably going to roll her as a result of that, because you know she's a good unit that will stand up down the stretch. The reason, though, that I think this is a concern is because of everyone other than Melisson. So if you try to look at your other AoE Lancers here, again, on paper, it doesn't look like Melisson's that strong. Again, you could maybe sit here and go like, okay, 31k, that would kind of put her up at the top here. But, you know, hey, that's not that crazy, right, Cad? And the problem with a spreadsheet like this is it doesn't show all the effects of having all the buffs, of having an MLB Black Grail leveled to 100, any sort of thing that can really add a lot of firepower to the mix. And that's really what changes things for Melisson. None of the other Lancers here are going to be touching Black Grail if you're trying to 3-turn with them, other than maybe, again, some of your Arts Lancers or something like that. But the Buster ones are kind of stuck out in that regard. The reason I make this point is because if you have a unit that is kind of head and tails above the rest of the pack in their performance, you have a problem then. The problem isn't that they're necessarily breaking your game or anything like that, or that they're, you know, slaughtering people in PvP, because we don't have that in FGO. This is where the logic comes in of, well, hey, Kat, it's just a single player game, so why does it matter? But it matters when you're trying to sell people on another unit. So now imagine instead that Romulus is getting a banner. I've heard this said by numerous other people that just in my community, but also, you know, on Twitter, on Reddit, wherever else that you may talk to people about the game, you know, hey, oh, why should I roll X unit when I have Y? When I know, you know, Z unit is coming, right? You're not gonna roll Romulus if you're waiting on Melisande because you know she's gonna outperform him for a lot of your needs. Now, again, there may be some of you out there that will still roll Romulus in spite of that. That's probably because you like him, or maybe you're just someone that collects all the units. But still, it's an interesting problem to have when you have one unit that is sort of the go-to unit. In fact, when I made that video about the single target archers and the situation that they kind of have going on right now, a lot of people were commenting like, well, okay, but what about, again, like Super Orion? Yeah, like Super Orion kind of defeats the point of that. Well, he wasn't strictly a single target archer because, again, he's got a support NP basically, but still, it's an interesting thing where everyone was kind of saying, well, CAD, this point doesn't hold a lot of water. These units can't get buffs because that's the go-to really good unit. That's a problem. You shouldn't have one unit held up as the sort of epitome of the class. We can definitely have units that are sitting on top for balance purposes. That's not an issue. But when you have one unit that is so heads and tails above the rest, all of a sudden it becomes really hard to try and convince people to roll on another unit that they just don't already like because they have a good unit that already takes that place, or they know that good unit is coming. Look no further than with Galatea, with a lot of people saying, well, I have Vlad or Kriemhild's coming. You got a similar scenario there, and it's fine to have this on a small level. It's not fine though when it's just one unit kind of really controlling that narrative. Then you have issues because it's definitely going to impact people's willingness to roll the unit. And so that's why balance matters. If you keep the units closer together in their performance, you don't let one unit stand so high above, all of a sudden it becomes a lot easier to convince people to roll, where they say, hey, you know, maybe Melisande I'm not the biggest fan of. Maybe I really like Romulus. Maybe I really like Erish Kagall. Maybe I really like Vitra or something like that. And so as a result, I'm just going to stick with them because they're close enough. They're good enough in terms of equivalence. But when you have one unit that's really outperforming, that becomes a much harder judgment call to make for a lot of people. So that is one of the big concerns there, is convincing people to roll when one unit is horribly imbalanced one direction and another unit's horribly imbalanced on the reverse end. Maybe they're too weak, they haven't received enough buffs. That's another issue in and of itself. The next one that you have there is content invalidation. I'm going to use Melisande again as an example of this, and I don't want anyone to think that I hate Melisande or anything like that. It's just she is a, to me, very clear outlier right now in the game's balance structure. She's a unit that I think represents quite a bit of power creep for what the devs have sort of laid out as the standards for other units. And actually, we have had other units say that have gotten close to her recently, like say Kukulkan, but still, this is a really easy scenario for me to draw. And that's that, you know, I've heard a lot of people basically say like, oh, you know, Melisande's so strong that I can use her in some sort of neutral standpoint or against even her counter class. In fact, there were people that were using Melisande in the recent 90++ node on JP that is using sabers. So that's kind of crazy because there's a lot of units out there with 90++ nodes now that can't 3-turn those nodes because they're just simply not strong enough. And then meanwhile, a unit that's in the ideal settings can counterclass it. That's not a good thing. You don't want your content basically getting invalidated like that. You want it to be something that, hey, yeah, you can actually still take the unit that's effective and you're incentivized to do that, rather than just, you know, say, no, I don't care, I'm just going to use that. We saw this actually for years as well with Space Ishtar, where a lot of people would just say, oh, I'm just going to use Space Ishtar for everything. And I pointed that out too, that while Space Ishtar is a great unit, that they almost overtuned her because they sort of invalidated anyone's need to roll and sort of made it so that a lot of the content could just be done by looping over it with a Space Ishtar. So when you have a one-size-fits-all solution to every one of your problems, you have no problem anymore. And that represents a bad design choice from the devs. They need to keep things where, yeah, there are reasons to take different units. And it's why I've actually said that one of the best ways that they do handle this is actually the niches at play that some units have, where, hey, you know, maybe our units are really similar in terms of their performance, but then when they have a special niche, that's when you use the unit. That's when they're stronger. And so that does feel like they're still trying to do that to some extent, but it almost feels like with some units, they just kind of throw that out and say, whatever, we're just going to make the unit strong irregardless of everything else going on. So that's something that, again, like I said, they don't ever want to make their content to the point that it just doesn't really, you know, pose any threat. And that's kind of the next point here as well, is that you have almost the erosion of challenge. I've actually heard a lot of people basically say this for a unit like, say, well, actually, she's not going to be on this list, but a unit like, say, Castoria. Because again, Castoria gives you a lot of party-wide protection that just had not been there before. I actually talked about that in the welfare video with Iris Veal, saying how kind of having a unit that can just outright nullify damage definitely represents a little bit of an issue for a balance concern. Now, the devs have done fights that do sort of get in the way of that. They buff strip, or again find some way to like stun or charm or something like that on the Castoria to make it so that she can't be as effective, or maybe you have to come up with some other decent solution to it. But you do have the Invincible Comp for a reason, and if you guys are unaware of what that comp is, it's basically a comp that utilizes stacking multiple MPs in a row to get the maximum amount of overcharge that you possibly can for the maximum amount of stacks that you can possibly get out of Castoria's Solemn Defense. And the logic works that if you can get enough of them, you never get hit, and so you are functionally invincible. And in the amount of time in which those stacks would fall off, you basically can get back to the NPs and do it all again. And that's how the Invincible Comp works in a nutshell. Now, it doesn't work on every fight. In fact, it's not a truly invincible comp. There are plenty of things that can get through it, and there are plenty of fights that can get in the way of it. But it is a concern to sort of look at this and then say, like, oh, hey, yeah, on one end you have sort of the erosion of challenge because, again, you've made units too good at what they do. And at least with regards to Castoria, there's no other unit like her that does what she does. There are units that are similar. There are units that can function to a decent capacity, but they don't have that same protective power that she does. So it's a really, really interesting problem that I think the devs have, and it's yet another, I honestly, I love Castoria, but this is yet another misstep, I would say, by the devs, where they maybe made a unit wrong. I understand, and I'm going to talk about why they may do stuff like that in the end, but give me a minute here and I'll keep making some of these points. So the other issue here, though, is that you almost have the flip side of this problem. If you have scenarios where there are no challenge because you've released a unit that's too strong, and again, this also happens, and we can look back at this in terms of like power creep and stuff with looking at like Lost Belt content versus like Part 1 content. And yes, the game should get harder as you go up and move on, but certainly, you know, again, it's no secret that you can basically just waltz through a lot of Part 1 by just taking a high-powered, high-octane berserker a lot of the times and just kind of not care about it. And that's kind of interesting that you see that happen. But then on the flip side, you maybe have content that is too difficult. Now, what do I mean by that? Because I don't really actually think there's content that's too difficult in this game. Not right yet. But basically, let's talk about the recollection quests. The recollection quests take fights that were a thing in normal content and basically just inflate the health values by a good like 5 times to maybe even 10 in some cases. So the reason that becomes an issue is not everyone has the capability of doing stuff like this. Now, to the devs' credit, they definitely did state that yes, the recollection quests were not meant for everybody and not everyone should be able to complete them. But I think that's sort of a blanket catch-all statement that they kind of got to make to stop the new player from trying to go into a recollection quest and then immediately hating it and being like, what the heck, devs, why can't I do this? But still, I feel like this is a really interesting problem because a lot of these health values felt like they were meant to sort of class out certain units. Basically, it was a response to the power creep that they themselves created. So a lot of this is a reflection of Oberon in the game, and I'll talk about him here in a second too, because basically what Oberon does is he ends up with his third skill here not only just giving you like 50% buster up, which again I've actually pointed out that a lot of people choose to view Oberon as only a buster support, but God, I can make the case for using him in every card type system because he just is a phenomenal damage booster, period. So the real broken thing about Oberon isn't this. In fact, this is almost unnecessary to him being strong. It just makes him stronger. But the real broken thing about him is this: the grants NP damage boost up for 1 turn. Because what it does is it takes every source of NP damage that the unit has, the buff specifically, not a unit's natural noble phantasm damage. It takes every source of the NP damage buff and basically doubles it. That is significant. I talked about this when Oberon came out, when we finally got a look at his third skill, because we only knew the first 2 skills, and even from the first 2 we knew he was a 70% charger before he showed up. But this third skill here really just blew the ceiling off the game. Straight up, this just amounted to a massive scale up in damage capability for a lot of units out there in the game. And the devs have no one to blame for this but themselves. They're the ones that made a unit this strong. And again, he is so strong that he beats the pants off of Reigns and Waver from a neutral perspective, from a value added for damage perspective. Oberon still wins in all those categories, not even factoring in his 50% buster up. So that's how you know they made a unit really strong. And I think you can talk to anyone playing on JP and they would absolutely tell you that yes, Oberon is absolutely spiking the damage values because of that. So why is that a problem then though? Why can they not, balance content around Oberon? Well, they can, but the problem then is the assumption that everyone must have an Oberon. And that's definitely not good when you consider that they went 18 months without giving him a banner. And a lot of people rolled Kayanskaya on that first banner and not Oberon, and then ended up having to wait 18 months to get him. And pretty much by the end of those 18 months, with 90 plus nodes out and super recollection quests all up in people's faces, people were screaming for Oberon. People were angry that he even went over a year without getting another banner. So by the 18-month mark, yeah, people were fed up and really wanted a banner for him. And finally, he ends up getting one. But again, that's the issue. So you can't just assume for a limited SSR that doesn't get banners on the regular that everyone has it. That's the problem with balancing content around the unit that you absolutely power crept the game with. It instead becomes a punishment and a sort of judgment on anyone that didn't roll him. And that's the thing I'm ultimately worried about here. It's not that you can't do these quests without Oberon. You can, it's just a lot rougher, and it's pretty clearly designed in such a way that they wanted to make the health values large so that people either couldn't use Oberon or that, again, only the whales could do it. And the reason I say this is because even just having an Oberon does not mean you can 3-turn some of these quests. Instead, you need an Oberon and a NP5 of a unit to be able to do a lot of these. And it's kind of funny to watch, as you can see the whales 3-turning these super recollection quests. And I'm sure it'll be hilarious when it gets to NA in that regard as well. But again, for JP, and certainly for anyone that's free to play out there, this almost feels like an unfair standard. So while even if you were to say, hey, well, CAD, the super recos weren't necessarily designed for that, you do have 90 plus nodes that clearly are designed around that. A lot of the 90++ nodes are sort of meant to, it really feels like, try to kind of invalidate a lot of those neutral loopers, try to stretch the health values enough that you need to use a damage bonus unit, that you need to use a unit that is somehow like super effective by having, you know, not just being the effective class, but also having the right niche to exploit against the units. And so that's the problem that we're having with a lot of 90++ content, is most of the nodes, other than the more recent one here that we just got, tended to have just a handful of possible solutions. So you almost see the invalidation of a lot of the roster for being able to do the nodes efficiently. Well, these are event nodes, so you don't necessarily have to 3-turn them. You know, again, if you're just on limited AP, if you're just doing your nat AP every single day, you can certainly just say, you know, what's the big deal if I 5-turn? And that's a thing. But then you get to something like, say, the Lotto 90++ nodes, and nobody's going to want to 5-turn those. Everyone's going to want to be able to do those in 3 turns and try to maximize their efficiency. So this is where this becomes a problem. And this is why I said balance is an issue in the game, not just for rolling, but also for content reasons. They don't want to make the content too easy, and they don't want to make the content too hard. They make it too easy, the content is just totally invalidated and there's no challenger issue whatsoever. They make it too hard, a lot of the player base can't do it reasonably and just mentally checks out or avoids it. In fact, that is what happened with a lot of these super recollection quests. A lot of players just didn't do it because they didn't feel like the reward actually was worth the time spent. And I gotta be honest, as someone that did every single one of them, even I felt like it really wasn't worth it in the end, because some of them just took an exorbitant amount of time, or resorted in people having to solo them with certain select units. And that's not a good thing either if people are having to solo your content. It's one thing to allow for it, it's one thing for it to be a legitimate strategy. It's another thing when people feel like that is the only strategy by which they can get the job done. So that is why balance is a concern there. Now, I said I would talk about, you know, what is maybe the devs' considerations here. So keep in mind, the reason the devs do things like this, the reason that they do power creep their game, is they do kind of need a reason for you to keep rolling new units. If all they keep giving you is more of the same, you are just going to look at that new unit and be like, well, I already have Vlad. Why should I roll a Galatea? And instead of it just being that select situation, it becomes every situation. So they do have to move the goalpost some, but it definitely felt like, at least in a couple of select circumstances, that they really moved that goalpost. Now, what's interesting though is, like, say in Castoria's instance, it wasn't nearly as restrictive. Basically, yeah, there was a big jump there, but kind of everyone benefited from that. Whereas in the case of, say, someone like Melisson, someone like Kukulkan, someone like Oberon, that's a little bit more, hey, you kind of got to have all the parts to build the system, and it's not nearly as easy to do. And so it becomes a lot more of a, you know, do you actually have the account capability? So I understand the devs needing to do that. I also understand the devs needing to provide some level of challenge. That does explain health bloat at times. In fact, I largely think that super recollection health values and 90++ health values are a reaction to, oh no, we made Oberon a little bit too strong. His damage values are too good. And so that is why I think you see that. But that is a problem because, like I said, that just means that they're balancing content around players having Oberon, which screws anyone that doesn't. So again, let me know what you guys think on this. But my goal here with all of this was not to simply make you say, oh yeah, you know, the game is super imbalanced or anything like that. The goal was just simply to point out why balance is an important thing and why the devs have to pay close attention to it. And at times they do. At other times, I don't necessarily think they do the best job. But again, I think largely over the period of time that they have been designing this game, they have done a good job with it. So let me know what you guys think about that. Let me know what you guys would like to see them fix. Would you like to see them change the values of 90++ nodes? Do you think that it's okay for them to balance around things like Oberon? And what do you think about, again, you know, bringing units more in line with each other, trying to sort of not keep a perfectly level playing field, but, you know, at least get people closer in terms of performance capability together. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope it was thought-provoking for you, and I will see you guys for the next one. Have a good one.